Clara Whitfield pressed that wooden box against her chest and did not make a sound. Not when they surrounded her on the street. Not when Nathaniel Cross looked her in the eye and said quietly and pleasantly that she was a thief and everyone in town already knew it. She stood there with her boots in the dirt of Black Ridge, and she did not cry, and she did not beg, and she did not run. Not yet. She just looked at him and thought, "You don't know what's in this box, but you're terrified of it. And that means I'm the only thing standing between you and getting away with all of it." Then she ran. If this story already has your heart beating faster, subscribe to this channel, follow every part to the very end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Ethan Callahan found her. The summer heat was already sitting heavy on the Montana mountains, like a man who'd worn out his welcome. He had ridden out before dawn to check the north fence line, a section that kept pulling loose, no matter how many times he hammered it back. His horse, a big roan gelding named Scout, moved easy through the dry grass, ears flicking at the jays cutting across the sky. Ethan didn't talk much, not even to Scout. He'd learned a long time ago that silence kept a man out of trouble. He wasn't expecting trouble that morning. He found it anyway. He smelled the smoke first, thin and sharp. Not the good kind of smoke that meant a cook fire and coffee, but the nervous kind. The kind that meant something had gone wrong and someone was trying to fix it fast. He turned Scout up toward the tree line, and that's when he heard it. A woman's voice. Not crying, not calling for help. Cursing. Quiet, tight, controlled cursing, the kind a person does when they are absolutely furious and absolutely alone and have no intention of letting anyone know either of those things. Ethan slowed Scout to a walk and came around a stand of pine, and there she was. She was crouched beside the remains of a cook fire that had clearly tipped one knee on the ground, her blue cotton skirt already carrying a long black scorch mark up the side. She was pressing a folded cloth against her left forearm, and her jaw was set so hard he could see the muscle working from 15 feet away. On the ground beside her, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and wedged half under her boot to keep it from sliding, was a wooden box. Small, dark with age. The brass latch on it was latched. She heard Scout's hooves, and she was on her feet in less than a second, the cloth still pressed to her arm, her back straight, her eyes level with his. "I don't need help," she said. Ethan looked at the overturned fire, the burned skirt, the cloth she was pressing to what was clearly a burn on her arm, and the box she'd managed to get her boot back on top of, even while she was standing up. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He didn't move. She didn't move either. "You're on Callahan land," he said, not unkindly. "I know whose land it is." She lifted her chin. "I'll be gone before dark." "Where are you headed?" Something moved behind her eyes. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that had learned to wear a harder face. "That's my business," she said. "It is," he agreed. Scout shifted his weight, and Ethan let him, not pulling the reins, just letting the horse settle. He looked at the woman again. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe late 20s. Brown hair pulled back in a knot that had been neat once and wasn't anymore. A face that was tired in a particular way, the kind of tired that didn't come from one bad night, but from a long stretch of days where nothing had gone right. "You need to clean that burn," he said. "I'm aware. I've got water and clean cloth back at the house. Comfrey root too if the salve hasn't dried out." She stared at him like she was trying to figure out what the offer was going to cost her. "Why?" she said. It was a simple question, and it wasn't. He'd heard that word asked that way before, not as curiosity, but as armor. "Why would you help me? What do you want from me? What does this cost?" "Because you're hurt, and you're on my land," he said. "And because it's the right thing to do." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at the cloth against her arm, which was starting to show red through the fibers. "I'm not going to be beholden to anyone," she said. "You won't be." Another long pause. "I can walk, and she said. "Scout can carry double." "I said I can walk." He nodded. "Then I'll walk him alongside you." He dismounted, and she didn't argue, which he took as agreement. Her name came out slowly, The way information came out of a person who had learned that information could be used against them. Clara. Just Clara at first. Then after he'd handed her the tin of comfrey salve and turned his back to give her privacy to dress the burn, she said, Clara Whitfield. Ethan said his name. She already knew it. She'd said she knew whose land this was, and she meant it. She'd known before she came up the mountain. He filed that away and didn't ask about it yet. His place wasn't much to look at. A farmhouse that needed a coat of paint, it wasn't going to get anytime soon. A barn that was in better shape than the house, because a man's priorities showed in what he maintained a kitchen garden that was surviving despite his inconsistent attention. He brought her inside and pointed her to the table and put water on the stove and didn't ask her any questions while she looked around the kitchen with those careful eyes. She was cataloging exits, he realized. She did it fast, and she tried to make it look like she was just glancing around, but he'd seen men do the same thing, and he knew what it meant. Someone had made this woman afraid. She sat at the table with the wooden box in her lap. She hadn't put it down since he'd found her. "You don't have to hold that so tight," he said. "Nobody's going to take it." Her hands tightened on it. He went back to the stove. After a while, she said quietly, "They will if they find me." He didn't turn around. He kept his voice level. "Who's looking?" Silence. "Doesn't matter," she said. "I'll be gone before dark like I said." "And where will you go?" The silence that followed was a different kind, not guarded, but hollow. He turned around with the kettle and found her looking at the table, her hands still on the box, her face doing something complicated that she shut down when she realized he was watching. "I don't know yet," she said, and it cost her something to admit it. Ethan poured the water, set the cup in front of her, sat down across the table, not close enough to crowd her far enough to give her room. "There's a spare room," he said. "Hasn't been used in a while. You can stay tonight if you need to figure out the next step." She looked up. "I told you I won't be beholden. Room and board in exchange for work," he said. "I've got a kitchen garden that's half dead, fence line that keeps pulling loose, house that needs—" He paused, looked at the walls. "Attention." She followed his gaze. He watched her clock the peeling wallpaper, the window latch that didn't catch right the gap under the back door. "I'm a seamstress," she said slowly, "and I know herbs." "Then you know more than I do about at least half of those problems." The corner of her mouth moved, almost a smile, not quite. "One night," she said. "One night," he agreed. She didn't leave after one night. He didn't say anything about it. She showed up in the kitchen garden the next morning, before he was back from the barn, and he found her on her knees in the dirt, pulling up whatever had gone to seed, and muttering to herself about water drainage. The wooden box was on the porch step 2 feet behind her where she could see it. That afternoon he came in from mending fence, and found she'd patched the window latch and sealed the gap under the back door with a strip of leather she'd cut from one of his scrap pieces. She was back in the garden when he went to thank her, and she waved him off, like thanks was an inconvenience. 2 nights became 3. 3 became a week. He didn't push. She didn't explain. And a kind of quiet understanding settled over the place that was different from the silence Ethan had been living in for the past 4 years, which had been the silence of a man who'd decided he was done needing anything from anyone. This was different. This was 2 people being careful around each other for different reasons. It was on the 8th day that Margaret Doyle rode up the drive. Ethan saw her coming and felt his jaw tighten. Margaret ran the general store in Black Ridge and had opinions about everything and everyone within 20 miles. She was not a bad woman. He knew that had known her family for 30 years, but she was a woman who mistook knowing everyone's business for understanding it, and those were 2 very different things. He came out of the barn, and she pulled up her wagon and looked at him with that expression she wore when she had decided she was doing somebody a favor. "Ethan," she said. "Margaret. I heard you had someone staying up here." He waited. "The Whitfield woman," she said. "I've got a hand helping with the place this season," he said. "That a problem?" Margaret glanced toward the house. "I think you should know who you've taken in." "I know who I've taken in. Do you?" She folded her hands in her lap. Because what I've heard is that woman is a thief, that she stole from the Harlan family down in Millhaven Money Papers property documents, that Nathaniel Cross has been looking for her for 2 months. The name landed like a stone. Ethan didn't let it show on his face. I've heard that name, he said carefully. He's a respectable man, owns half the valley south of here. He came through town last week asking after her, said she took documents that belonged to him. And you believed him? I don't have reason not to. Ethan looked at her for a moment then. You ever actually talk to the woman? Margaret paused. I don't see what, because respectable men have told respectable lies before, and women have gotten run out of towns for it. He pulled his gloves off, folded them over his belt. I appreciate you riding up, Margaret. You need anything from me before you head back? It was a dismissal. She recognized it and didn't like it, but she took it. I'm just telling you what I know, she said, gathering the reins. And I'm telling you what I've seen, he said. She drove off without another word. Clara was in the kitchen when he came back inside. She'd been there long enough to have heard everything from the window, and she wasn't pretending otherwise. She was standing at the counter with her hands flat on the wood and her eyes on the far wall. You can ask, she said. I know you're going to. I'm not going to ask anything you haven't decided to tell me. She turned around. That's not how people work, she said. Maybe not. He hung his hat on the peg by the door. But it's how I work. She looked at him for a long time. Her hands came off the counter and went to her sides, and he could see her making a decision, the way you could sometimes see a person choose between 2 paths that both scared them. Nathaniel Cross, she said. You know the name. I've heard it. What have you heard? That he's a man who owns things, Ethan said, and that he's the kind of man who considers people to be among the things he can own. Something in her face shifted. He owned Millhaven, she said quietly. Not officially, not on paper, but he'd been doing it for 15 years, moving documents, changing records, buying debts, and calling them due when people couldn't pay, and taking the land. Quietly, carefully, so nobody could prove it. She paused. Except that one of the men who worked for him got old and scared of dying with it on his conscience, and he wrote it all down, signed it, put it in a box. Ethan looked at the wooden box on the table. He gave it to you, Ethan said. His daughter did, after he died. Her voice was flat. 3 days after the funeral, Nathaniel Cross came to my door with 2 men and a story about how I'd stolen from the Harlan estate where I'd worked as a seamstress. He told it to the sheriff first, then the whole town. And nobody believed you. Nobody had reason to. She said it without self-pity, which was somehow worse than if she'd cried. I was a seamstress. He was Nathaniel Cross. He had lawyers, and I had a box of papers that nobody would look at because by then they'd already decided what I was. The room was quiet. Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. How long ago? 8 weeks. How'd you end up here? I knew this mountain range. She looked at the box. My father used to bring me up here when I was young. Said the mountains didn't care what anybody in town thought of you. A short breath, not quite a laugh. He was right. Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Those papers, he said. Have you read them? Every one. They're enough. Her eyes came up to his. They're enough, she said. He nodded slow. All right, he said. She frowned. All right what? All right, he said again, like it was its own complete answer. I'm going to get some coffee going, and then I want to hear what's in those papers. All of it. She stared at him. Why? She said. And there was that word again, the same way she'd said it the first day, but smaller now. Less armor. More genuine. He looked at her steadily. Because nobody listened to you, he said, and somebody should have. She talked for 2 hours. She laid out what was in the box, and Ethan listened and asked quiet questions and didn't interrupt and didn't look at her with that particular kind of male patience that was actually condescension wearing a different coat. He listened like a man who understood that listening was an act and not a performance. The old man's name had been Samuel Pratt. He'd worked as Nathaniel Cross's land manager for 19 years, handling all the paperwork, all the records, all the small and large corruptions that Cross had built his empire on. He'd written it all down in the last months of his life. Names, dates, amounts, which sheriff's deputy had been paid to look away, and when which judge had dismissed which claim, and for how much, which widow's deed had been altered, and how. His daughter, Ruth, had trusted Clara. Clara had made her wedding dress had been the one sitting with Samuel at the end when Ruth couldn't be there. She'd pressed the box into Clara's hands at the graveside and said, "Don't let him have this. It's the only thing that can stop him." Cross had come for it 3 days later. "How is polite?" Clara said, and the way she said polite made it sound like a synonym for dangerous. "He was always polite. He said there'd been a misunderstanding, that I had some documents that belonged to his estate, that he was sure I hadn't meant to take them. Just hand them over and everything would be fine. And when you didn't, he told the sheriff I'd stolen $600 from the Harlan house." She looked down at the box. "By the time I got to the sheriff's office to tell my side, 3 people had already confirmed his story. People who hadn't been there. People who needed something from Nathaniel Cross and knew which way the wind blew." Ethan said nothing for a moment. "My brother," he said finally. She looked up, surprised by the shift. "I was in a land dispute," Ethan said. 4 years ago. Man named Deering claimed he had a prior deed to the water rights on my brother's property. It was a lie. The deed was forged. We could see it. But Deering had money and lawyers and friends in the right offices, and we had—" He stopped. His hands on the table were very still. "We had the truth." Her voice was careful. "What happened? My brother fought it for 2 years. It broke him down. His wife left, took the children. He couldn't work the land without the water rights, and he couldn't afford to keep fighting." He paused. "He died in the spring 2 years ago. Heart gave out." He said it simply, like a fact. "I think he just decided to stop." Clara was very quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm telling you because I understand what it is," he said. "To have the truth and have nobody believe it. To watch a man use the law like a weapon." He looked at the box. "Cross won't stop," he said. "You know that." "I know that." "He's going to come here." "I know that too." Her chin came up. "That's why I have to keep moving. I can't—" She stopped. "I can't let him find it here. I can't bring this to your door." "He's already at my door," Ethan said. "Margaret Doyle made sure of that this afternoon." The color came out of her face. "Then I'll go tonight," she said, starting to rise. "Sit down." Something in his voice, not commanding, not harsh, just certain, stopped her. She sat. "Running doesn't end it," he said. "You know that. You've been running for 8 weeks and he's still finding you." He leaned forward. "Those papers need to get to someone who can use them. A federal marshal, a judge who Cross doesn't own, someone outside his reach." She pressed her lips together. "And how does a woman with no money and no name and no one who believes her get to a federal marshal?" "She doesn't go alone," Ethan said. Clara stared at him. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a dove was working its low, repeated sound from somewhere in the pines, steady and unhurried, and the summer afternoon was pressing its warmth through the window. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough. You could be ruined for this. If Cross turns his attention to you—" "He's the kind of man who took my brother's land and called it legal," Ethan said. "I've got no interest in his good opinion." She looked at her hands. "Why?" she whispered for the 3rd time. But it was different now, not armor, not suspicion. Just a woman who had been alone with a terrible weight for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "My father told me something once," he said. "He said the measure of a man isn't what he does when things are easy. It's what he does when things are hard and nobody's watching." He stood up, picked up his hat from the table. "Nobody's watching, Miss Whitfield." He said it quietly. "So I reckon I'll do what's right." He went out to finish the evening chores, and he left her sitting there with the box in her hands and something in her eyes that had not been there that morning. Something that looked very carefully and very tentatively like the first fragile edge of hope. She didn't sleep well that night, and she knew it showed in the morning. Clara came down to the kitchen before the sun had cleared the ridge. The wooden box tucked under her arm, the way it always was, and she found Ethan already at the stove with coffee going and a pan of eggs moving in the iron skillet. He didn't look up when she came in. He just reached for a second cup and set it on the table without a word. That small gesture, the cup already there, already ready, like he'd expected her, cracked something loose in her chest that she quickly pressed back into place. She sat down, wrapped her hands around the cup, watched him cook. "You were up late," he said. "I was reading them again." He knew what she meant. He didn't ask her to elaborate. "All of them. All of them." She set the cup down. "Ethan, if Cross gets to the right people before we do, if he finds out where I am and gets to the county seat first, and files something, anything to discredit me before those papers reach a federal marshal, it's over. He's done it before. He's good at it." Ethan slid the eggs onto a plate and set it in front of her. "Then we don't let him get there first," he said. "That is a significant amount easier to say than to do. Most things are." He sat down across from her with his own plate. "Eat." She ate. It surprised her. She hadn't had much appetite in weeks, but something about sitting at that plain wooden table in the early morning quiet, with a man who was not looking at her like a problem to be solved or a threat to be managed, made the eggs go down easy. After a while she said, "You said federal marshal. There's one in Helena. There's one in Butte, too. Closer. Cross has connections in Butte." Ethan considered this. "Helena it is. It's 4 days' ride. 3 if we push." She looked at him. "We." He met her eyes. "We." She looked back down at her plate. "I need you to understand something," she said quietly. I'm not a woman who needs rescuing. I've been managing this alone for 2 months. I know what's in that box, and I know what it's worth, and I know what it costs to keep it." "I know that," he said. "I'm telling you because I need this to be an arrangement between equals, not a man deciding to save a woman, and the woman being grateful for it." He was quiet for a moment. "The way I see it," he said, "you have the evidence, and I know the roads. That sounds like equal to me." Something in her shoulders came down a fraction of an inch. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. And that was how it was decided. They had 3 days, maybe 4, before someone told Nathaniel Cross exactly which mountain Clara Whitfield had gone up. Margaret Doyle hadn't done it out of malice. She wasn't that kind of woman. But Margaret talked, and the people Margaret talked to talked, and Cross had ears in every town between Millhaven and the Montana line. 3 days. Maybe less. Ethan spent the morning getting the horses ready and checking the saddlebags and going over in his head every route between here and Helena, which passes were open in the summer and which ones were watched. Clara spent the morning at this kitchen table with every paper from the box laid out in order, making a clean copy of each one in her careful seamstress handwriting in case anything happened to the originals. It was mid-morning when the rider came up the drive. Ethan heard the horse before he saw it and came out of the barn with his hand already at his side, not reaching for the rifle on instinct, but aware of it, the way a man in the mountains was always aware of what was around him. The rider was a boy. 16, maybe 17, with Thomas Hale's look about him. Thomas, who ran the livery in Black Ridge and had 4 sons, who all had his same narrow face and big hands. "Mr. Callahan," the boy said, pulling up. He was breathing fast, like he'd pushed the horse harder than he'd planned. "My father sent me. He said you needed to hear this before anyone else." "Step down," Ethan said. The boy dismounted. "Man came into the livery this morning," he said, "before we opened. He was already waiting outside when Pa got there. Real well-dressed. Spoke like money. Asked Pa had he seen a woman come through, brown hair, came from Millhaven direction." The boy paused. He had a paper, like a notice. It said Clara Whitfield wanted for theft and fraud. Had a description and everything. Ethan kept his face even. He leave the paper, left 3 of them, said there was a reward for information. The boy shifted. "Pa sent me to tell you because he figured you'd want to know on account of the woman staying here. He didn't tell the man anything," he added quickly. "Pa's not that kind. "Tell your father I'm grateful," Ethan said, "and that I'll settle up with him." The boy nodded, mounted, and went back down the drive. Ethan turned and walked back into the house. Clara was still at the table. She had heard. He could tell by the way her hand had stopped moving across the paper and the way her back had gone rigid, and she was sitting very still with the pen still in her hand. "How long?" she said. It wasn't really a question. "He was in town this morning." She put the pen down. "We need to go today," she said. "I know. Now. I know." He was already moving to the back room to get the rifle. "Finish copying what you can. You've got 20 minutes. She had it done in 15. He watched her pack the originals back into the box with quick, practiced hands. Every paper in order, wrapped in the oilcloth, the lid latched and the latch checked twice. Her face was composed in the way a person's face went composed when panic was trying to get out, and they had decided it wasn't going to. "You're afraid," he said. "Of course I'm afraid." She looked up. "I'm not an idiot." Being afraid and being an idiot are different things. Yes, they are. She picked up the box. "Let's go." They were out of the house and into the saddle in under 10 minutes. Ethan took the high trail north before cutting east longer by half a mile, but it stayed above the road and away from the town, which was where Cross's man would be spending his morning. He let Clara set the pace. She rode well better than he'd expected, not tentatively, not the way someone learned rode, but with a kind of economical confidence that said she'd grown up on horseback and hadn't forgotten it. The wooden box was buckled into her saddlebag. They were 2 miles out when she came up alongside him. "Tell me about the pass at Miners Creek," she said. He glanced at her. "What do you know about Miners Creek? My father used to talk about it. Said it was the fastest way through the mountains going east without touching the main road." "It is," he said. "It's also rough going, rocky, steep on the east side. But Cross's men won't know it. If they're from Millhaven, no." She nodded. "Then that's the way." He looked at her riding beside him. This woman who had been alone for 2 months with a box full of evidence and a target on her back, and who was now plotting their route through the mountains, with the calm focus of someone who had decided that fear was something you carried with you, not something you stopped for. He faced forward. "Miners Creek it is," he said. They didn't talk much after that. The mountain didn't allow for it. The trail required attention, and attention was what they gave it. But somewhere in the late morning when they stopped to water the horses at a creek that ran cold and fast over smooth rock, Clara sat on a boulder and looked out at the mountains and said something that had clearly been sitting in her for a while. "Samuel Pratt was 72 years old," she said. "He spent 19 years helping Nathaniel Cross take things from people. Land, water rights, homes." She paused. "He told me at the end that he'd told himself it wasn't his business, that it was legal, that somebody else would stop it if it was really wrong." She turned the cup she'd filled from the creek slowly in her hands. "He said that was the worst kind of lie a man could tell himself. That because something could be done, it should be done." Ethan said nothing. "He cried," she said. "This old man, 72 years old and dying, and he cried because he had spent nearly 20 years being wrong and he couldn't fix it. All he could do was write it down and hope somebody did something with it." She looked at the box strapped to her saddle. "I promised his daughter," she said. "At the graveside, I promised Ruth that I would do something with it." Her voice didn't waver, but her hands tightened on the cup. "I'm going to keep that promise." Ethan looked at her. This woman who had been run out of her town with a lie nailed to her name, and had been alone in the mountains for weeks, and was still here, still holding, still moving forward. He thought about his brother. He thought about the 2 years James had spent trying to fight Deering's forged deed, and the toll it had taken, and the morning he'd ridden over to James's place and found it empty, and known in his gut before anyone told him that it was too late. He thought about what it would have meant if someone had stood up for James. "You'll keep it," he said quietly. She looked at him. He held her gaze. "You'll keep the promise," he said. "I'll make sure of it." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face did something he hadn't seen it do yet. It didn't go harder or more careful. It just went quiet. A different kind of quiet than the guarded silence she'd been carrying. Something that was almost rest. "We'd better ride," she said. "We'd better," he agreed. They rode. By mid-afternoon, they were well into the high country, and the air had changed thinner, cooler, carrying the smell of pine and granite, and the road below was invisible, irrelevant. Up here, there was only the trail and the sound of the horses and the occasional hawk riding a thermal overhead. It was Clara who heard them first. She pulled up without warning, and Ethan came up short beside her. "Listen," she said. He listened. Hoofbeats. Below and behind them, not close, but not far enough. Moving fast. He calculated the trail, the terrain, the time. 2 riders, he said. At least. They know the area, or they got lucky with the direction. Either way, they're coming. She looked at him. We can't outrun them on this trail. No. He scanned ahead, thinking. But we don't need to outrun them. We need to lose them. There was a split in the trail ahead. He knew it had ridden this mountain for 15 years. The main trail kept going east toward the pass. The left fork was overgrown and hadn't been used regularly in years, going up toward an old mining claim and then dead-ending at a rockfall. Most people who didn't know the mountain would have no reason to know what was up that left fork, and past the rockfall if you knew it. If you'd climbed it as a boy with your father and knew exactly which way the rocks had fallen, there was a way through. Tight. Difficult. But possible. Take the left fork, he said, and stay close. She didn't hesitate. She turned her horse. The overgrown trail was harder going. Branches low and reaching the footing loose in places, the grade steeper than it looked. Clara handled it without complaint, keeping her horse moving with the same quiet competence he'd noticed in her from the beginning. Behind them, the hoofbeats grew, and then at the fork stopped. He heard voices, 2 men deliberating. He held his breath. Clara held hers. The voices stopped. Hoofbeats again, continuing on the main trail east. He let out a slow breath. They don't know it, Clara said quietly. No. He moved his horse forward. But they'll figure out they've lost us and come back. We've got maybe an hour. She nodded and followed him toward the rockfall. She didn't say anything about the rockfall when she saw it, just looked at it the way she looked at most problems, with a focused assessment that stripped away the drama and went straight to the question of how it was navigated. You've been through this before, she said. Twice. Once with my father, once alone. Then you go first and I follow exactly. He went. She followed. The horses were unhappy about it, but they were good horses, and they trusted their riders, and in 15 minutes of careful, precise movement, they were through the gap in the rock and onto the east side, and the trail opened up ahead of them, clear and fast, dropping down toward the river valley. They stopped on the other side and let the horses breathe. Clara reached back and checked the saddlebag with the box. Still there, still latched. She turned to him. There was something in her eyes that was not quite the look she'd been carrying for all the days since he'd found her. Something slightly less braced against the world. You knew that was there, she said. My father showed me. Do many people know it? Enough that we shouldn't count on being able to use it twice. He looked back at the rockfall. If they're serious, and they are, they'll have people who know this territory by tomorrow. Her jaw tightened. We need to move faster, she said. We need to move smarter, he corrected. Faster gets you into trouble in the dark on mountain roads. Smarter gets you to Helena. She looked at him. You're an aggravating man to argue with, she said. Most people give up eventually. Something close to a smile crossed her face and was gone. We camp somewhere defensible tonight, she said. High ground. Clear line of sight. I know a place. Of course you do, she said, and turned her horse east. He followed, and something he had not felt in a long time moved quietly in his chest. Something that was almost like being part of something again, after 4 years of being only himself. He ignored it. They had a long way to go. They made camp just before dark on a limestone shelf above the river that gave them sightlines in 3 directions and a rock wall at their backs. It wasn't comfortable, but it was defensible, and comfort wasn't the priority tonight. Clara built the fire small and set it well back against the rock so the light wouldn't carry. He noticed without commenting that she'd learned the same things he'd learned, the things you learned when you understood that someone might be looking for you. They ate what he'd packed: dried meat, hardtack, dried apricots, and Clara put coffee on with the economical precision of a woman who had been camping without help for weeks. It was good coffee, better than his. He said so. She looked faintly pleased and quickly arranged her face back into its usual composure. "Tell me about Cross," he said. She poked the fire with a stick. "He's from old money," she said. "Carolina family. Came west 20 years ago when the opportunities were better out here for a man who knew how to work a system." She paused. "He's not a brute. That's what makes him dangerous. He doesn't threaten people, he arranges things so that people threaten themselves. He makes you dependent, and then he makes you afraid, and then he offers you the solution that also happens to benefit him. Smart. Very." She looked at the fire. He had the sheriff in Millhaven convinced he was a civic benefactor, donated to the church, funded the schoolhouse, showed up at every funeral, and shook every hand. Her voice was flat. The people he ruined quietly, one at a time, far enough apart that nobody connected the pattern. Until Pratt wrote it down. She was quiet for a moment. "He came to my door the morning after I'd gotten the box from Ruth. He didn't demand. He asked, so politely. Said there'd been a misunderstanding, that some of his private papers had gotten mixed into Samuel's things, and Ruth must have given them to me without knowing. He was so reasonable, so measured." She stopped. "And I looked at him, and I thought, you know exactly what's in this box, and you are terrified. And that's when you knew it was real." "I already knew it was real. Samuel told me. Ruth told me." She looked up. "But seeing Nathaniel Cross afraid confirmed something. A man like that isn't afraid of nothing. He's only afraid of something that can actually stop him." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He's going to come himself," Ethan said. "Once his men report back that you've disappeared into the mountains. He won't trust anyone else to handle it." "I know. Which means we have less time than we thought." She met his eyes across the fire. "I know that too, she said. They were quiet for a while. The fire snapped. The river moved below them, low and steady. "My father's name was James Callahan Sr., Ethan said. He didn't know why he said it, just that the dark and the fire, and the way she talked about Samuel Pratt, had made him feel like it needed to be said. "My brother was James Jr. We all called him Jamie." She waited. "I was a better farmer than me," Ethan said. "Better with people, too. He could walk into a room of strangers and come out with friends. I never learned to do that." He looked at his hands. "When Deering came with the forged deed, I told Jamie to fight it. I told him the truth was enough. I was so sure the truth was enough. You couldn't have known. I should have." His voice was level, but the words cost him. "I'd seen enough by then to know that truth needs a champion, or it just stays quiet. I let Jamie carry it alone, because I figured the law would do its job." He paused. The law didn't do its job." Clara said, "What would you do differently?" He looked up. She was watching him with those steady eyes, not with pity. She knew better than to offer pity to a man like him, but with the kind of attention a person gave when they understood that the question actually mattered. "I would have gone to Helena," he said. "Myself. First week. I'd have put those papers in front of a federal marshal, and I'd have stood there until someone listened." She held his gaze. "That's what we're doing," she said. "For Samuel Pratt. And for Jamie," he said quietly. "And for every widow and farmer and family that Cross took from, too. Something settled between them, then, not quite a promise, but something heavier and more permanent than an agreement. The kind of thing that happened between people who had separately carried something alone for too long and had found without quite intending to that they were carrying it together now." "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll take first watch." She nodded and lay down near the fire, the saddlebag with the box close enough to touch, and he watched her close her eyes, and then he turned to face the darkness of the mountain and thought about Helena and the roads and Nathaniel Cross and the fact that tomorrow was going to be harder than today. He didn't mind hard. Hard was something he understood. What he was less sure about was the woman sleeping 6 feet away, and the way this had already started to feel like something more than an arrangement between equals who each had something the other needed. He pushed that thought away firmly and watched the dark. 2 hours later, Clara came upright without a word, completely awake, and said, "Your turn." He lay down. She settled into the watch like a woman who had done it before, quiet and alert, and he closed his eyes. He was asleep in under a minute. It was the best sleep he'd had in 4 years. He filed that away and decided not to think about what it meant. But it meant something. He knew it meant something. And somewhere in the dark on the far side of the fire, with her eyes on the mountain and the box within arm's reach, Clara Whitfield pulled her jacket tighter and watched the trail below and thought carefully, and not for the first time, that Ethan Callahan was not like any man she had ever had the occasion to trust. She hadn't decided yet whether that made him more dangerous or less. She was still thinking about it when the morning came up gold over the ridge, and Ethan's eyes opened, and he looked immediately alert and sat up and said, "We need to move." "I know," she said. "How long have you been watching?" "Long enough." She handed him the coffee she'd already started. "Rider on the South Trail, moving slow, looking." He took the cup, stood, looked where she was looking. "One rider, one visible rider," she said, "which means at least one more somewhere we can't see." He looked at her. "You're good at this," he said. "I've had practice I didn't ask for," she said. He drank the coffee. She broke the camp. And in less time than ought to have been possible for 2 people and 2 horses on a limestone shelf above a mountain river, they were packed and moving east toward Helena, east toward the Marshall, east toward the moment when Samuel Pratt's last act of courage would either count for something or be swallowed by the same silence that had covered everything else Nathaniel Cross had ever done. Clara did not look back at the shelf. Ethan did not look back at the mountain. They looked forward, and they rode. They rode hard through the morning and didn't stop until the horses demanded it. Ethan knew this stretch of mountain the way a man knew his own hands. Every switchback, every loose rock stretch, every place where the trail narrowed, and you had to trust your horse more than your eyes. He pushed them as fast as was safe, and Clara kept pace without complaint, riding with her eyes moving constantly, checking the trail behind them, checking the ridgeline, checking the gaps between the trees, the way a woman checked every room she walked into. She'd been doing it since the moment he found her. He wondered how long it had taken her to learn that, and what it had cost her to learn it so well. They stopped at a creek crossing to water the horses, and Clara was off her horse before it had fully stilled, checking the saddlebag, checking the box, checking the latch. He watched her do it, and didn't say anything, because it wasn't something she was doing out of nervousness. It was something she was doing because that box was the whole reason they were on this mountain, and she was not the kind of woman who left things to chance. "How far to this next town?" she asked without looking up. "Ridgecrest. 4 hours, maybe 5 in this terrain." "Do you know anyone there?" "A man named Cole Pryor. Runs the telegraph office. He's straight." She looked up at that. "You're sure?" "As sure as I am about anything." She considered this. "We should send word ahead to Helena. Let the marshal's office know someone's coming with evidence. If something happens to us on the road, the papers still get there," he finished. "Yes." He hadn't thought of it, and he should have. He nodded. "Ridgecrest it is," he said. They mounted and rode. The thing about being on horseback for hours through mountain terrain was that it gave a man or a woman a great deal of time inside their own head, and not all of that time was comfortable. Ethan had spent 4 years getting used to the particular quality of his own silence, the kind that had scar tissue in it. This was different. Clara rode 15 feet to his left, and he was aware of her, the way he was aware of weather coming, not looking directly at it, but knowing it was there, knowing it was changing the quality of the air. She'd slept 6 feet from him, and he'd slept better than he had in years. That was a fact he couldn't logic away, so he'd stopped trying. It was mid-morning when she pulled up sharp. He stopped beside her. "There," she said quietly, and tipped her chin. He looked. A rider on the ridge above them. Still. Just sitting there looking down. Not moving toward them. not moving away, just watching. Ethan's hand went to the rifle without thinking. "Don't," Clara said very low. "If he's Cross's man, and he's alone, he's not here to take us. He's here to mark our position." He kept his hand still. "Which means someone else already knows where we are," he said. "Or he's sending word right now." Her voice was flat and precise. "We need to move, and we need to change direction long enough to lose him. If we change direction, we lose time. If we don't change direction, we lose the box." She looked at him steadily. "What's the next trail south?" He thought fast. "Shepherd's Pass. Comes out below Ridgecrest, adds 40 minutes. Take it." He turned his horse south and she followed, and when he looked back up at the ridge, the rider was already gone. That was worse than if the man had stayed. Shepherd's Pass was steep and rocky and miserable in the summer heat, and neither of them said a word through most of it. Ethan's mind was working through the angles Cross had known their general direction, which meant the man in the livery had talked after all, or there was someone else in Black Ridge who'd seen which way they'd ridden out, or Cross's network was wider and faster than either of them had calculated. Any of those options was bad. The third one was the worst. They came out below Ridgecrest with the sun high, and both horses tired, and Ethan's jaw set in a way it got when he was working hard not to show how much he was thinking. "Say it," Clara said. He glanced at her. "Whatever you're working through," she said. "Say it." "I'm thinking Cross knew our direction before we left my property." She absorbed this without flinching. "Margaret Doyle. Maybe. Or someone else in town who saw us ride out. Or someone who was already watching your place before we left." The thought sat between them like something with weight. "If he had someone on my property," Ethan said slowly, "he knew you were there before Margaret came up." "Which means the visit from his man at the livery wasn't looking for me," Clara said. "It was confirming I was found." The air went out of the conversation. She said it first, steady and quiet. "He knew where I was. He was waiting for the right moment to come and take the box himself." Ethan said, "And we rode straight out into open mountain." "Yes?" "Which he expected." "Yes." They looked at each other. "He's better at this than I gave him credit for," Ethan said. "I told you he was," she said, and there was no satisfaction in it, just the flat acknowledgement of a woman who had been underestimated all her life and had long since stopped being surprised when people finally believed what she'd said. He nodded once tight. "Then we stopped being predictable," he said. "They didn't go into Ridgecrest together." Ethan went in alone while Clara stayed with the horses in the trees a quarter-mile out the box, strapped close her eyes on every approach. He rode an easy hat low, stopping at the water trough in front of the telegraph office, like a man with nowhere particular to be. Cole Pryor was inside, a small man of 60, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and ink-stained fingers, and the kind of careful eyes that belonged to a man who processed everyone else's information and kept his own counsel. He looked up when Ethan came in, and his face went through a complicated series of expressions before landing on neutral. "Ethan Callahan," he said. "You look like you've been riding hard." "I have been." Ethan pulled the door shut behind him. "I need to send a wire to Helena, Federal Marshal's office, and I need it to go quiet." Cole looked at him over the glasses. "Quiet how?" "I need it to go, and I need nobody to know it went." A pause. Cole put down his pen. "Is this the business about the woman?" he said. "There's been talk. There's always talk. The talk's wrong." Ethan kept his voice level. "She has evidence of land fraud going back 15 years. Real evidence. Names, dates, amounts. She needs to get it to a federal marshal before the man it implicates gets there first." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "Nathaniel Cross," he said. Ethan said nothing, which was answer enough. Cole removed his glasses from his forehead, entirely folded them, set them on the desk. He looked at the wall for a moment, like he was doing arithmetic in his head. "My wife's family lost water rights in Millhaven 11 years ago," he said. "Nobody could ever prove why the deed transfer went wrong." He picked up his pen. "What do you need the wire to say?" Ethan told him. Cole sent it. He also, without being asked, pulled out his ledger and recorded the wire under a different sender name and a different timestamp and looked up at Ethan and said, "I never saw you today." "Much obliged," Ethan said. He was back in the trees with Clara in 20 minutes. She read his face before he said a word. "It went through," she said. "It went through." She closed her eyes for 1 second, just one, and then she opened them, and she was back composed and forward-looking and ready. "How long before someone from the marshal's office can reach us?" 2 days at the fastest. We still need to get to Helena ourselves. The wire tells them something's coming, not what it is. She nodded. "Then we keep moving." "There's one more thing." He paused. "Cole Pryor's wife lost water rights in Millhaven a decade ago. He thinks Cross was behind it." Clara was very still. "How many people?" she said quietly. "How many people did he take from, and nobody ever—" She stopped. Her voice didn't break, but it came close, and he could hear in it all the weeks of carrying this alone, all the mornings she'd woken up with that box, and the weight of everything in it, and nowhere to put it. "Enough," he said. "Which is why we're going to finish this." She took a breath, squared her shoulders. "Then we ride," she said. They rode. The ambush came at a creek crossing 6 miles east of Ridgecrest. Ethan saw it a half-second too late, the way the horses on both sides of the trail moved wrong. Too still, too positioned. And then there were 2 men coming out of the trees on each side of the trail, and one of them had a rifle leveled, and the other had his hand up in the universal gesture that meant, "Don't." Clara pulled her horse up sharp and didn't make a sound. 4 men total. They were well dressed for being in the mountains. Cross's men, not frontier roughnecks. The one who stepped forward was the tallest, and he held himself with the careful authority of a man who had done this kind of thing before and been well paid for it. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Callahan." He tipped his hat. Actually tipped it like this was a social call. "No one needs to be hurt here." "Then lower the rifle," Ethan said. "The rifle stays where it is until I have what I came for." The man looked at Clara. "We both know what that is." Clara looked at the man with an expression that Ethan had not seen on her face before. Not fear, not defiance. Something colder than either. Something that had been refined by 8 weeks of running until it was very, very sharp. "You work for Nathaniel Cross," she said. "I work for a man who wants his property returned. Those papers aren't his property. He says different. He would." She didn't move her hands from the reins. "What's your name?" The man blinked. He hadn't expected that. "Doesn't matter," he said. "It matters to me," she said. "Because when this is over, and it will be over, and not the way Nathaniel Cross thinks, I want to be able to put a name to the man who stopped me on a mountain road and pointed a rifle at an unarmed woman." A silence. The man with the rifle shifted his weight. The tall man looked at her for a moment, and something moved behind his eyes. Something she'd put there, something that hadn't been there before she'd spoken. "Hand over the box," he said. "And you both ride away." "No," Clara said. "Clara," Ethan said low. "No," she said again, and her voice was completely steady. "Because we both know that's not what happens. We hand over the box and he destroys it, and we ride away with nothing but his word, that it's over, and his word is worth exactly what every word he's ever said is worth, which is nothing." She looked at the tall man. "You know what's in those papers, or you wouldn't be here. So you know that the moment they're gone, there's no reason for him to leave witnesses." The air changed. The tall man's jaw tightened. The rifle, Ethan noticed, didn't lower, but the angle shifted just slightly in a way that meant the man holding it was thinking about something other than his aim. "He told you to get the box," Clara said. "Did he tell you what he'd do after? That's none of your concern. I think it might be yours." Her voice didn't rise. "How many jobs has Cross used you for? How many of them ended with someone you'd looked in the face, ending up with nothing they could do about it?" "That's enough," the tall man said sharply. "Samuel Pratt worked for him for 19 years, Clara said. 19 years. He died afraid and ashamed because he'd spent 2 decades helping Nathaniel Cross take things from people and calling it legal. Is that what you want to be in 20 years? I said that's enough." "It'll never be enough," she said quietly. Because you already know I'm right." The tall man stared at her. Ethan's hand was at his side. He was calculating 4 men, 1 rifle up, 1 rifle on the saddle, 2 men without visible weapons, but carrying them somewhere. His odds were not good. Her odds of talking her way through this were strange and entirely dependent on whether the next 30 seconds went right. Then something happened that none of them expected. The man with the rifle lowered it. Not all the way, not a surrender, but he lowered it enough that it was pointing at the ground between them and not at Ethan's chest. And he said roughly to the tall man, "I didn't sign on for shooting people, Vernon." Vernon, that was the tall man's name, evidently turned to look at his man. "Nobody's shooting anybody," he said tightly. "Didn't look that way 30 seconds ago," the rifleman said. The other 2 men exchanged a look. Ethan did not move. Clara did not move. The creek ran underneath them, indifferent and cold. Vernon looked back at Clara. His face was doing something complicated. "Those papers get to the marshal," he said slowly, "and Cross goes down for what's in them. Every name, every deed, every bribe, every judge and deputy he paid off. Yes." Clara held his gaze. "And every man who helped him, who wasn't there by choice, has a chance to come forward and say so before someone else tells that story for them." Vernon was quiet for a very long moment. Then he said, "I want nothing to do with what's in that box." "Then step off the trail," Ethan said. Vernon looked at him. Then he looked at his men. Then he looked at the trail. Then he did something Ethan had not expected from a man who'd been sent by Nathaniel Cross to stop them. He stepped off the trail. His 3 men followed. Clara didn't wait. She moved her horse forward, and Ethan moved with her, and they rode through the gap where 4 men had been standing and didn't slow down. And Ethan did not look back, because looking back was for people who weren't sure they'd made the right move, and he was sure. How was sure? Because Clara had done something remarkable. She hadn't argued the law, or the evidence, or the rights of it. She'd talked to those men like they were people who still had choices, and she'd been right, and it had worked. They were a mile down the trail before she said anything. "That won't hold," she said. "He'll report back to Cross, and Cross will send someone else." "I know. But it bought us time." "It did." He looked at her. "That was something what you did back there." She looked at him, and he could see in her face that she was still running on the adrenaline of it. The particular elevated clarity of a moment that had gone right when it had no particular reason to. "Samuel Pratt told me something," she said. "He said the worst thing he ever did wasn't helping Cross. The worst thing he did was stopping the people who worked for Cross from thinking they had another option." She paused. "Those men had another option. You gave it to them." "No." Her voice was quiet. "It was already there. I just said it out loud." He looked at her for a moment. This woman he'd found burned and alone on his mountain 12 days ago, and he thought about all the things she'd carried and was still carrying, and the fact that even now, with Cross's men behind them, and Helena still a day away, she was thinking about Samuel Pratt and the choices people made when someone told them they had one. He thought about Jamie. I thought about what it might have looked like if someone had said that to the judge who dismissed Jamie's deed challenge. He faced forward. "We make the river crossing before dark," he said. "We camp on the other side." "Agreed," she said. They pushed hard through the afternoon, and the horses were tired, and the terrain wasn't kind, and neither of them had eaten since morning. But they moved with the focused efficiency of people who had stopped pretending this was anything other than what it was, a race against a man with more resources than them, more connections, more time invested in making sure the truth stayed buried. An hour before dark, with the river crossing ahead, Clara's horse went lame. It happened fast. A misplaced hoof on a loose rock, a stumble, and then the horse was moving wrong, and she was already off before Ethan could say anything, on the ground with her hand running down the horse's foreleg, her face intent and focused. "How bad?" he said. "Not broken," she said. "But she can't carry weight tonight." He calculated. His horse could carry double for the river crossing. Rest at camp managed tomorrow if they went careful. It was workable, but it was slow, and slow was what they could least afford. "Leave her," he said. "I'll come back for her after Helena." Clara looked up sharply. "She's your horse." "She is. And she'll still be there. He dismounted. Come on, we cross before dark. Clara looked at the horse for a moment, and he saw in that look all the things she wasn't letting herself feel right now. All the accumulated weight of the past 12 days and the 8 weeks before that. The particular exhaustion of a person who had been strong for so long that they'd forgotten they were tired. She pressed her hand once against the horse's neck. "I'm sorry, girl," she said quietly. "I'll be back." She turned to Ethan, and he was already adjusting the saddlebags, and she helped him without discussion, working fast and quiet. And then she put her foot in his offered hand and swung up behind him and settled with her arms going around his waist, the saddlebag with the box pressed between them. He felt her hands at his sides, and he didn't say anything about that either. Scout moved toward the river crossing steady and willing, carrying double without complaint. Clara said from behind him, "If Cross gets ahead of us, he won't." "If he does, he won't," Ethan said again, and his voice had something in it that was not reassurance exactly, but something steadier than reassurance. Certainty. The kind that came not from knowing how something would go, but from having decided that you were going to make it go right, regardless of what it cost you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sound like you've made a decision." "I made it 10 days ago when I put coffee on for a woman who told me she didn't need help." A pause. "You are an aggravating man," she said for the second time since they'd started this ride. "You said that already." "It bears repeating." He almost smiled. Almost. They crossed the river with the last of the light scout, picking his footing carefully on the slick rocks, the water cold and fast around his legs, and Clara's arms tightened fractionally at his sides when the water rose toward Scout's belly, and then loosened again when they came up onto the far bank. They made camp in the dark, which was not ideal, but they'd both done worse. No fire tonight, they were too close to the road, and Cross would have men moving in the dark. Now Cross was not a man who waited. They ate cold and talked quietly, and at some point Clara said, "Tell me something about Jamie that has nothing to do with the land dispute." He looked at her in the dark. "He used to make the worst coffee you ever tasted in your life," Ethan said. "Terrible. Every single morning. And he'd drink it like it was the finest thing he'd ever had, and look at you like you were wrong for not agreeing." She made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," she said. "He was," Ethan said. "He was worth knowing." A quiet. "Tell me something about Ruth Pratt," he said. "Samuel's daughter." Clara was quiet for a moment. "She was the bravest person I've ever met," she said. At the graveside with her father, not even cold, and Cross's men already asking questions around the edges. She pressed that box into my hands, and she didn't cry. She just looked at me and said, "Don't let him win." A pause. She could have burned those papers. She could have given them up and been safe. She chose not to. "So did you," he said. "I made a promise. You kept it past the point where most people would have stopped." He looked at her across the dark. "That's not obligation. That's character." She didn't answer right away. Then, "Go to sleep, Ethan. You go first. We're not doing this again. Last night worked fine. Last night I had a fire to watch. Tonight you've got a ridge to watch. Wake me in 2 hours." She made a sound of exasperation that was also somehow not entirely annoyed. He heard her settle. He watched the ridge. The stars moved overhead, the way they always did, indifferent and enormous, and somewhere out there in the dark, Nathaniel Cross was making his calculations, the same way he always made them, adding up what he owned, and what he could buy, and what he could arrange, confident in the arithmetic of power. Ethan thought about the telegraph wire Cole Pryor had sent. He thought about the marshal's office in Helena. He thought about the morning and the miles still ahead. And then, because it was unavoidable, he thought about Clara Whitfield sleeping 6 feet away, with that wooden box within arm's reach, and the particular quality of certainty she carried, the kind that had looked 4 armed men in the eyes, and found the crack in them, the kind that had kept a promise to a dead man's daughter for 8 weeks through mountains and cold, and a name that had been turned into an accusation, the kind that didn't ask for rescue, the kind that built its own cabin on the mountain, and planned its own route to the marshal, and copied every document in its own hand in case something happened to the originals. The kind that said "we" when he offered to help and meant it as exactly equal. He thought about all of that. He watched the ridge and let those thoughts sit where they were, not pushing them away anymore, just letting them be what they were. 2 hours later, she came upright without a sound and said, "Your turn." "Anything," he said. "Quiet," she said. "But there are riders on the South Road, moving. They're not stopping." He sat up. "How many?" "I counted 5 before the trees took them." 5 was more than Cross had sent after them before. "He's coming himself," Ethan said. "I think so." He looked at her in the dark. "We need to be in Helena before he gets ahead of us," she said. "We'll make it." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." He stood, picked up the rifle. 2 hours and we ride." She lay back down. He turned to the ridge and the dark road below it, and the 5 riders he couldn't see anymore, but could feel the weight of moving through the night. Cross was coming. Good. Let him come. Ethan Callahan had been waiting 4 years for a man like Nathaniel Cross to show his face somewhere he could do something about it. And Samuel Pratt's courage, and Clara Whitfield's promise, and Jamie's memory, and the weight of everything that had been taken from people who had no one to take their side. All of that was sitting in his chest right now, steady and hot and absolutely prepared. Let him come. They rode before first light. Ethan had. Clara up and the saddlebags repacked, and Scout moving before the sky had done anything more than shift from black to the deep blue-gray that came just ahead of dawn. Clara didn't complain about the hour, or the cold, or the fact that she'd had less than 2 hours of sleep. She mounted behind him without a word, her arms settling around his waist with the same matter-of-fact steadiness she brought to everything, and they moved out. 5 riders on the South Road the night before. Moving with purpose, not searching. That meant Cross had a destination in mind, not just a direction, which meant he either knew where they were camping, or he knew where they were going and had decided to get there first. Helena. "He's going to try to discredit the evidence before we arrive," Clara said. Her voice was close to his ear, quiet against the sound of Scout's hooves on the hard trail. "Not destroy it. He can't destroy what he doesn't have. He'll try to get ahead of us and tell his version of the story first." "Poison the well before the water gets there," Ethan said. "He's done it before. He did it in Millhaven. He did it with the sheriff before I even knew I needed to defend myself." Her arms tightened fractionally. "If he reaches the marshal's office first and files a complaint, theft, fraud, anything, and then we walk in with those papers. We walk in already looking like suspects instead of witnesses." Ethan worked through the angles. "Cole's wire," he said. "The marshal already has word that evidence is coming. Cross will say the evidence is fabricated, that I stole it, that you're helping me for—" She paused. "For reasons." He understood what she meant by reasons. "He'll make it personal," Ethan said. "Make it look like you've got someone defending you for the wrong motivations. And then everything we bring gets filtered through that." Scout moved steadily beneath them, and the mountain began to lighten, and somewhere behind them on the South Road, 5 riders were doing the same arithmetic with very different numbers. "How long to Helena from here?" she asked. 6 hours if we push Scout and he holds up." "Can he?" Ethan put his hand briefly on Scout's neck. The roan moved strong, and even under them tired, but not spent. "He can," he said. "Then we push." He pressed his heels in, and Scout stretched out into a faster pace, and the mountain moved past them in the gray early light. And Ethan thought about the marshal's office, and the wire Cole had sent, and whether there was anyone in Helena who was already in Cross's pocket, because there was always that question. There was always that calculation. How far did the man's reach go? How many favors had he called in? How many people in how many towns had decided that looking away was easier than looking straight? He thought about Jamie, who had looked straight and paid for it. He thought about Samuel Pratt, who had looked away for 19 years and paid for it differently, but just as finally. There was no clean way through a man like Nathaniel Cross. There was only forward. They pushed. 3 hours out from Helena. They hit the flat valley road, and Scout opened up properly for the first time in 2 days. moving the way a good horse moved when the terrain finally allowed it, and Clara held on and didn't say anything about the speed or the wind or the dust coming up from the road. It was on the flat valley road that they saw the rider coming toward them. Not from behind, from ahead. Ethan pulled Scout down to a walk without thinking and felt Clara's hands tighten at his sides. One rider moving fast, coming from the Helena direction. "Do you know him?" Clara said quietly. Ethan watched the rider's shape resolve as the distance closed. Tall man, good horse riding with the upright posture of someone who'd spent professional time in a saddle. "No," Ethan said. His hand went to the rifle, stayed there. The rider pulled up 20 feet ahead of them and raised one hand in the clear gesture of a man who was not reaching for a weapon. "Callahan," he called. Ethan kept his hand on the rifle. "Who's asking?" "Deputy Marshal Charles Holt out of Helena." The man reached into his coat, slowly watching Ethan watch him, and produced a folded paper. "Got a wire 2 days ago from a telegraph operator in Ridgecrest. Said someone was coming in with evidence of land fraud and might need a meet on the road." He looked at Clara. "Miss Whitfield." Clara straightened. "Yes," she said. "Ma'am." He tipped his hat. "You want to tell me you've got trouble behind you, or do you want me to tell you I already know?" "A beat." "Both," she said. "How much do you know?" "I know Nathaniel Cross rode into Helena yesterday evening with 2 lawyers and a document claiming you stole property from his estate." Holt's voice was measured and professional. "He filed a formal complaint with the marshal's office this morning at 7. Clara's hands went rigid against Ethan's sides. "He got there," she said. It was barely a whisper. "He got there first," Holt said. "But he didn't get there only." He looked at Ethan. "That wire from Ridgecrest came before Cross arrived. Marshal Briggs read it before Cross walked through the door. He told me to ride out and find you before Cross's lawyers could file for an injunction." "An injunction to do what?" Ethan said. "To have whatever evidence you're carrying seized as stolen property pending investigation." Holt's jaw was set, which would put it in a lockbox in the county courthouse for 6 to 18 months while lawyers argue over it. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Clara said very quietly, "He thought of everything." "He's had 20 years of practice," Ethan said. "Ma'am," Holt said, "what exactly are you carrying?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached back and unbuckled the saddlebag and brought out the wooden box and held it where Holt could see it. "Signed testimony from Samuel Pratt," she said. 19 years of land fraud documentation. Names, dates, payments, altered deeds. 2 sheriff's deputies, 1 county judge, and 4 land clerks on Cross's payroll. 11 families whose property was taken through forged or manipulated documents. She looked at him steadily. "All of it signed, witnessed, and dated in Pratt's own hand before he died." Holt looked at the box. He looked at it for a long time. "Ma'am," he said, "how fast can you ride?" "As fast as necessary," she said. "Then we need to be in Helena before those lawyers finish their paperwork," he said. "Because once that injunction is filed and stamped, I can't touch anything you're carrying until a judge rules on it, and the nearest judge who isn't on Cross's Christmas list is 2 weeks out." He turned his horse and Ethan pressed his heels into Scout, and the 3 of them moved toward Helena at a pace that left conversation behind. They came into Helena from the North Road at just past midday, Holt leading Ethan and Clara close behind, and Ethan felt the town press in around them with all the particular density of a place where things were decided. The streets wider than mountain towns, the buildings taller, more people moving with more purpose in more directions. And somewhere in one of those buildings, Nathaniel Cross was sitting with his lawyers and his calm voice and his 20 years of confidence that he could arrange any outcome he needed. Holt took them straight to the federal building without slowing down. He was off his horse and at the door and holding it before Ethan had finished helping Clara dismount, and she came down with the box in her arms and straightened and looked at the building and took one breath, one single visible breath. And then she walked through that door like a woman who had been walking toward it for 8 weeks and was not going to stop now. Marshal Briggs was a broad man of 55 with a gray mustache and the kind of eyes that had seen most things and been surprised by less and less of them as the years went on. He stood up when they came in. He looked at Holt, looked at Ethan, looked at Clara, looked at the box. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Marshal Briggs." She set the box on his desk. "I believe you've been expecting this." "I have." He looked at Holt. "Cross's lawyers. Hadn't filed when I left," Holt said. "But that was 3 hours ago." Briggs nodded. He looked at Clara. "Sit down, Miss Whitfield," he said, "and tell me everything." She sat down. She told him everything. She was precise and thorough, and she went in order Pratt's employment with Cross. Pratt's documentation of what he'd witnessed, Ruth's decision to give it to Clara Cross's visit to her door, the accusation, the flight. She did not editorialize. She did not ask for sympathy. She laid out facts the way you laid out fabric before cutting it smoothly without waste, so the shape of the thing was visible. Briggs listened. He did not interrupt. Ethan stood by the door with his hat in his hands and listened to her and watched Briggs and knew in the first 5 minutes that this was a man who was actually listening and not performing the appearance of listening, and that was something that was not. Nothing. That was the thing they'd been writing 3 days and 2 nights toward. When she finished, Briggs opened the box. He looked at the papers for a long time. He picked up one, read it, set it down, picked up another. The room was very quiet. Then the door at the far end of the office opened, and a clerk came in with the particular rapid, careful steps of someone bringing news, and said, "Marshal, Cross's lawyers just filed at the courthouse. Injunction to seize evidence in the matter of Whitfield." Briggs didn't look up from the papers. "File number," he said. The clerk read it. Briggs set down the paper he was holding. He looked at the clerk. "Tell Judge Corrigan I need 5 minutes of his time," he said. "Right now. Tell him it's federal." The clerk went. Briggs looked at Clara. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I'm going to need your formal statement and these papers entered as federal evidence in the next 20 minutes. After that, they're mine, and Cross's lawyers can argue with the federal government, which takes considerably longer than arguing with a county courthouse." Clara looked at him. "Then let's not waste the 20 minutes, she said. Briggs almost smiled. Almost. He called in his deputy, and the statement began. Ethan stepped outside. He stood on the step of the federal building in the Helena summer heat, and he let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in his chest since the morning he'd found Clara crouched beside a ruined cook fire on his mountain, with a burned arm and a wooden box, and the words, "If you came to take me back, you're too late," on her lips. He put his hat on. He looked at the street, and then he saw Nathaniel Cross. He recognized him immediately, not from ever having met the man, but from the way he moved. Cross was coming down the boardwalk from the direction of the courthouse, with 2 men in suits beside him, and he moved like a man who believed the ground was obligated to cooperate with his intentions. Well dressed, as Clara had said. Silver at the temples. A face arranged into the expression of a man who was accustomed to arriving somewhere and having the situation rearrange itself to accommodate him. He saw Ethan on the step of the federal building. He stopped. The 2 lawyers stopped. Cross looked at Ethan, and Ethan looked at Cross, and the street moved around them with all of its ordinary noise, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Cross stepped forward. "Mr. Callahan," he said. He had a careful, pleasant voice, the voice of a man who had learned that a pleasant voice was a tool. "I don't believe we've met." "No," Ethan said. "We haven't. I understand you've been keeping company with Miss Whitfield." Cross's face showed nothing except a kind of measured concern, like a man addressing an unfortunate situation. "I hope she hasn't drawn you too far into something you don't fully understand." "I understand it fine," Ethan said. "She's a troubled woman. The accusations against her in Millhaven are false," Ethan said. "You know they're false. You filed them yourself." Cross looked at him for a moment. The pleasant voice didn't change. "You're a rancher, Mr. Callahan, a man with a good piece of land and a quiet life. I'd encourage you to think carefully about what you're involving yourself in." "I've thought about it," Ethan said. "These matters have consequences." "Yes," Ethan said. "They do." The 2 men looked at each other, and the street went on around them, and somewhere a horse moved past, and someone called out to someone else, and the ordinary world continued doing what it did, while 2 men stood on a boardwalk in Helena, and the weight of 20 years of taken land and silenced people, and one dead brother, and one dead old man, and a woman who had spent 8 weeks alone on a mountain, with the only evidence that could stop it all pressed between them, like something with its own gravity. Cross smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been smiled at and had smiled back at 1,000 moments like this, who had long since learned to wait out other men's certainty because other men's certainty always ran out eventually. "The law is a slow process," he said pleasantly. "I have good lawyers and a great deal of patience." "So does the federal government," Ethan said. Something moved behind Cross's eyes. Just a flicker. The first thing Ethan had seen that wasn't completely controlled. "Enjoy your afternoon, Mr. Callahan," Cross said, and moved past him toward the federal building door. Ethan stepped sideways and blocked it. Not aggressively. Not with any gesture toward the rifle on his back. Just by being in the doorway, a big man with his arms at his sides and his eyes level standing between Nathaniel Cross and the door. "Miss Whitfield is making her statement," Ethan said. "She'll be out when she's done." Cross's pleasant face hardened just fractionally. "I have business." "Your lawyers have business at the courthouse," Ethan said. "This is the federal marshal's office. The marshal will send for you when he's ready for you." One of the lawyers cleared his throat. Cross looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then he stepped back. He sat down on the bench along the building front and crossed his legs and folded his hands and looked out at the street with the composed patience of a man who had not yet lost and knew it, and was waiting for the moment when that would be confirmed. Ethan stayed in the doorway. 20 minutes later, Clara came out. She came out, straight-backed and composed, and holding nothing. The box was inside, entered as federal evidence, and her hands were empty for the first time since Ethan had found her, and she stopped when she saw Cross sitting on the bench. Cross stood. He looked at her with that same calibrated pleasantness. "Clara," he said. "Mr. Cross," she said. "This has all been very unnecessary," he said. "Those papers, whatever Pratt told you about them, this didn't have to go this far. I offered you a reasonable resolution." "You offered me silence," she said. "That's not the same thing." "I could still—" "No," she said. "You couldn't." She looked at him, and Cross looked at her, and in that moment, something in the architecture of his face shifted, not collapsed, not yet. He was too controlled for that, but something adjusted. Something that had been very certain became slightly less certain, and it showed briefly in the set of his jaw. "Those papers prove nothing that—" "They prove everything," she said quietly. "And Marshal Briggs has them now, and Deputy Marshal Holt, and the federal clerk who entered them into evidence 20 minutes ago, and the copy I made by hand that I gave to Cole Pryor in Ridgecrest to hold until I sent word." She let that last part sit for a moment. "A copy, in case anything happened to the originals." Cross was very still. "You're a careful woman," he said, and for the first time, his voice had something in it other than pleasantness. "I learned from watching what happened to people who weren't," she said. One of the lawyers touched Cross's arm. Cross didn't move. "This will take time," he said. "Investigations take time. Courts take time." "Yes," she said. "They do." She tilted her head slightly. "How's your patience, Mr. Cross, because I have been sleeping on Mountain Rock for 3 days, and I am still standing here, so I have a fair amount of mine left." Ethan watched this, and did not say anything, and did not need to. Cross looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Then he looked back at Clara, and something not, everything. Not yet. There were still lawyers and courts and time ahead, but something right there on that boardwalk in Helena, in the summer heat, cracked. Something in the 20-year certainty of Nathaniel Cross cracked, and he felt it, and she saw him feel it, and that was something that could not be unmade. He left without another word. The lawyers followed. Clara watched them go. Then she turned to Ethan. She looked at him, and she didn't say anything for a moment, and he didn't either, and then she said quietly, "It's not over." "No," he said. "Not yet." "The courts will take time," he said. "But the evidence is in federal hands. He can't touch it. He can't make it go away. All he can do is face it." He paused. That's different from anything he's dealt with in 20 years. She nodded slowly. Then from somewhere inside the composure she'd been carrying, like load-bearing architecture for 3 days, something eased, just slightly, just enough that he could see it. "Samuel Pratt," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Ruth." "Yeah." She pressed her lips together. "We did it," she said, like she was checking whether it was true. "We did it," he confirmed. She looked at the street where Cross had gone. She looked at the federal building behind her. She looked at the mountains visible from the far end of Helena's main street, blue and enormous in the summer light. Then she looked at Ethan, and something happened in her face that he had not seen there before. Not the almost smiles, not the composed steadiness, not the focused calculation. Something that was none of those things. Something that was just her, without any of the armor she'd been carrying so long, she'd probably forgotten what she looked like without it. She looked tired. She looked relieved. She looked like a woman who had kept a promise against every odd available, and was now standing on the other side of it. She looked like herself. "I need to sit down," she said. He almost smiled. "There's a diner across the street," he said. "I haven't eaten a real meal in 3 days." "I know. I want coffee that isn't made over a campfire." "That seems reasonable." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "I know I said equal arrangement and I meant it. But—" She stopped. "You didn't have to come down the mountain." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, I did," he said. She started to say something. "Come on," he said. "Before you argue with me, let's go eat." She closed her mouth. They crossed the street. Inside the diner, in a booth by the window, with real coffee and actual food on the way, and the immediate crisis for the first time in 3 days, not pressing against his ribs. Ethan looked across the table at Clara Whitfield and thought about the mountain and the spare room and the kitchen garden she'd pulled back from half dead, and the window latch she'd fixed, and the morning she'd had coffee waiting when he came back from the barn, and the way she'd talked to 4 armed men on a mountain trail and found the crack in them that changed everything. He thought about going back to his property alone. He looked at the table. He looked at her. She was watching him with those steady eyes. "You're thinking," she said. "I'm always thinking." "You're thinking something specific," she said. "You get a particular expression." He looked at her. "What expression?" "Like you've figured something out and you're not sure you want to say it." He was quiet. She waited. She was good at waiting. He'd noticed that about her from the beginning. She didn't fill silences to make herself comfortable. She let them exist until there was something worth putting in them. "My place is going to need someone in the kitchen garden," he said. "And the north fence keeps pulling loose." She looked at him. "And I reckon the spare room's been empty long enough," he said. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, "That's a very indirect way of saying something. I'm a very indirect man." "I noticed." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "What are you actually saying, Ethan?" He met her eyes. "I'm saying," he said slowly, "that whatever comes next, the courts, the testimony, the months of it, you shouldn't go through it alone. And I'm saying that my mountain is a good place to be, and it's been quiet in a way that wasn't good for a long time, and it's not quiet that way anymore." He paused. "And I'm saying I'd like that to continue, if you would." She looked at him for a long moment. The diner moved around them, the ordinary sounds of a town at noon, people eating and talking and moving through the ordinary motions of their lives, and across the table in a booth in Helena. Clara Whitfield looked at Ethan Callahan, and he looked back at her and waited, because she deserved the time to answer in her own way and her own time, and he was a patient man. "I told you I won't be beholden," she said. "And I told you you wouldn't be." "I mean it." "So do I." She looked at her coffee. "The north fence," she said. "Keeps pulling loose," he confirmed. "And the kitchen garden. Half dead without attention. And the spare room. Hasn't been used in 4 years," he said. "That's long enough." She was quiet. Then, "I'd want to send word to Ruth. Let her know the papers are in federal hands." "We can do that today. Cole Pryor can pass it through." She looked up. "And I want to go back for my horse," she said. "I said I would," he said. "I want to go myself." "All right." She looked at him across the table. This man who had walked out of his barn and into her crisis and had not once treated her like a problem he was solving or a woman he was saving, but like a person carrying something real who deserved someone to carry it alongside her, and something in Clara Whitfield that had been very tightly held for a very long time came loose, not broken, not collapsed, just released, the way a fist opened when it finally didn't need to hold on anymore. "All right," she said quietly. "The mountain." He nodded. "The mountain," he said. Outside, Helena went on in the summer heat, and inside the federal building 2 blocks away. Samuel Pratt's last act of conscience sat in federal evidence and was no longer hers alone to carry. And somewhere in the city, Nathaniel Cross was sitting with his lawyers and calculating his odds and finding for the first time in 20 years that they were not what he'd thought they were. And in a diner by the window, 2 people who had both been alone for too long sat across from each other with real coffee and the particular quiet of people who had come through something and were still standing and had, without quite planning it, arrived somewhere neither of them had expected. It wasn't everything resolved. The courts were slow and Cross was still dangerous and the road back to the mountain was long. But it was something. It was a start. And for the first time in 8 weeks, Clara Whitfield did not check the exits when she sat down. They stayed in Helena 3 days. Not because they wanted to. Because Marshal Briggs needed Clara's full formal testimony transcribed and witnessed and entered correctly. And because Deputy Marshal Holt needed Ethan's account of the ambush on the mountain trail. The 4 men, Vernon the conversation, and because the federal machinery of justice, once you'd finally gotten it moving, required a certain amount of feeding before it would run on its own. Clara gave her testimony twice. Once to Briggs, once to a federal recorder who wrote every word in careful longhand and had her sign each page. She did it without flinching and without embellishment, and Ethan sat outside both times because she hadn't asked him to be there, and he understood that this was hers to do, that she had carried this alone for 8 weeks, and the delivering of it needed to be hers alone too. He waited. He was good at waiting. On the second day, a wire came back through Cole Pryor's office in Ridgecrest. Cole forwarded it to the Helena telegraph office, and a boy brought it to the boarding house where they were staying separate rooms. Clara had been clear about that, and Ethan had not said a word, and the boy handed it to Ethan because Clara was still at the marshal's office, and Ethan was sitting on the front step working through what needed to happen when they got back to the mountain. He read it. Then he read it again. He sat with it in his hands for a moment, this small piece of paper with its abbreviated telegraph language, and he felt something in his chest that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it. The specific ache of a thing that was good, and came too late for the person who had most needed it. He was still sitting there when Clara came back down the street, and she read his face before she was 10 feet away. "What happened?" she said. He held out the wire. She took it. "Read it." The wire was from Ruth Pratt. It said, "Evidence received. Federal inquiry opened Millhaven. Papa's name will be cleared. Thank you. God bless you both." Clara stood on the boarding house step with the wire in her hands, and her head bowed, and her shoulders doing something that she was working very hard to control, and Ethan stood up and didn't say anything, and didn't touch her because she hadn't asked for either of those things, but he stayed close enough that she knew he was there. After a moment, she said very quietly, "He was so ashamed." "I know. He spent 19 years being ashamed, and he died ashamed." She pressed her lips together. "He deserved to know it counted." "It counted," Ethan said. "It's counting right now. That's why the inquiry's opened." She folded the wire carefully, put it in her pocket, lifted her head. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't let it go further than that. "Ruth knew," she said. "She always knew it would count. That's why she gave it to me." She took a breath. She was braver than anyone gave her credit for. "Most people are," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "They are." They left Helena the following morning early before the town was fully awake. Briggs had given Clara a federal receipt for the evidence, and a case number, and the name of the attorney, who would be handling the investigation out of the territorial office, and he'd shaken her hand and looked her in the eye and said that in 30 years of work, he had seen very few civilians hold together the way she'd held together. And Clara had thanked him with the composure of a woman who had been holding together so long, she wasn't entirely sure how to stop. Ethan had shaken Briggs's hand and said nothing, because Briggs hadn't needed anything said. Holt saw them off at the edge of town. He rode with them to the North Road turnoff and pulled up his horse and looked at Clara. "Cross has good lawyers," he said. "It'll take time." "I know," she said. "Could take a year, possibly 2. "I know that too. You'll need to be available for testimony. Could be called back to Helena. Could be called to the territorial court." "I'll be on the mountain," she said. "You'll know where to find me." Holt nodded. He looked at Ethan. "Take care of her," he said. Clara opened her mouth. "She takes care of herself," Ethan said. "I just keep the coffee going." Holt almost smiled. Clara closed her mouth. Holt tipped his hat and turned his horse and rode back toward Helena and Ethan, and Clara turned north, and the mountain was out there somewhere ahead of them, waiting the way it had always been, waiting patient and enormous and indifferent to everything that happened at its feet, which was one of the things that made it a good place to be. They rode. They went back through Ridgecrest first, because Clara had said she wanted to thank Cole Pryor in person, not in a wire, and Ethan understood that there were some things that needed a face attached to them. Cole was behind his desk when they came in, and he stood up when he saw Clara, and she crossed the office, and she took his hand in both of hers and said, "Your wife's family, the water rights in Millhaven. It's in the investigation, all of it." Cole Pryor looked at her for a moment. Then he sat back down in his chair heavily, like something had gone out of his legs. 11 years, he said. "I know," she said. "My wife." He stopped, cleared his throat. She never stopped believing it wasn't right. Everyone told her to let it go, and she never did. "She was right," Clara said. "Tell her she was right." Cole nodded. He pressed his hand over his eyes for a moment, and then he put his glasses on and looked up, and the professional telegraph operator was back composed, but different in some way that the last 10 minutes had made. "You need anything else before you head up?" he said. "No," Clara said. "You've done more than enough." He nodded once. Ethan tipped his hat on the way out. They found Clara's horse where they'd left her off the trail east of Shepherd's Pass, grazing on the summer grass with the philosophical patience of a horse who had learned not to worry about things outside her control. Clara was off scout and at her horse's side before Ethan had finished dismounting, running her hands down the foreleg with careful attention. "How is she?" he said. "Better." Clara straightened. She just needed the rest. She pressed her cheek briefly against the horse's neck, just for a moment. Then she stepped back and checked the saddle and tightened what needed tightening, and mounted. And they rode the last miles back to the mountain together with 2 horses and more room between them than there'd been for the past 4 days. It felt different, that extra room. Not easier, just different. Ethan noticed it and figured she did too, and neither of them said anything about it. The mountain came up around them, the way it always did, gradually, and then all at once the terrain shifting the air, changing the sound of it, becoming the particular kind of silence that wasn't actually silent, but was layered with all the things that made no sound humans could hear. His fence line, his barn, his house with the window latch Clara had fixed, and the gap under the back door she'd sealed, and the kitchen garden that was surviving improbably through everything. She looked at it all when they rode up, and he watched her look at it and tried to read what was in her face. There was something that might have been relief, something that might have been something more than that. She didn't say what it was, and he didn't ask. They unsaddled the horses in the barn and worked side by side in the easy silence of people who had spent enough time together in difficult circumstances that the ordinary motions of a shared task required no coordination, because coordination had already happened, somewhere in the riding and the camping and the watching each other's backs through mountain passes and river crossings. When the horses were settled, Clara went to the house, and Ethan went to check the north fence, because it was going to keep pulling loose until he dealt with it properly, and he was a man who dealt with things properly. I was out at the fence for an hour. When he came back, there was coffee on, and something that smelled like actual food, not trail rations coming from the kitchen, and the house had a quality to it that it hadn't had for 4 years, a quality that had nothing to do with what was cooking, and everything to do with the fact that someone was in it. He hung his hat and washed his hands and sat at the table. Clara put a plate down in front of him without ceremony. "You fixed the fence," she said, sitting across from him. "Temporary fix. Needs new posts on the north end." "I can help with that." He looked at her. "You know how to set fence posts." "My father had 20 acres, she said. "I know how to do most things." "Most things," he said. "The things worth knowing," she amended. They ate. Outside. The summer evening was doing what summer evenings did in the mountains, coming on slowly, the light going warm, and then gold, and then beginning its long, reluctant fade. After a while, she said, "I need to write to Margaret Doyle." He set his fork down. "Margaret. She didn't know what she was doing when she came up here and told you about me," Clara said. "She was doing what she thought was right with the information she had, which happened to be wrong information." She paused. "She deserves to know what was actually true." He thought about Margaret coming up the drive with her look of performed concern and her mouth full of Cross's story. "You're more generous than she was," he said. "I'm not being generous," Clara said. "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." She looked at her plate. "I spent 8 weeks being judged for something I didn't do by people who didn't ask me because they'd already decided. I'd rather not do that to someone else just because it was easier." He looked at her. "Write the letter," he said. "I intend to." They were quiet. Then he said, "She's going to feel terrible." "Yes," Clara said. "She is, and that's her to manage, not mine." She picked up her fork again. "But she should know, because if she knows, maybe next time someone comes to town with a story about a woman nobody knows, she'll ask the question before she decides." He thought about that. "I thought about all the Margarets in all the towns. Not bad people, not malicious people, just people who had decided that the loudest story was probably the true one, and had never had to reckon with being wrong." "Reckon there'll be a few people feeling that way when the inquiry gets public," he said. "Reckon so," she said. Something in the way she said it, the slight irony, the quiet acceptance of the shape of things, made him realize how completely she'd already made her peace with it. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something more practical than anger and less exhausting than bitterness. She had made her peace with it, and she was moving forward, and she was going to write the letter, and set the fence posts, and grow the kitchen garden, and she was going to do all of it, not because she'd forgotten what had been done to her, but because she'd decided that the forward direction was more worth her time than the backward one. He thought about 4 years of backward. He thought about what forward looked like. The evening settled in around the house, and Clara moved to the small table in the corner where she kept her paper and pen, and she wrote the letter to Margaret, and Ethan took the second cup of coffee she'd left for him, and went out to sit on the porch steps the way he did most evenings, and the mountain was there, the way it was always there. And the difference was that inside the house someone was writing a letter by lamplight, and that was different from all the evenings it hadn't been. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The north fence got new posts. The kitchen garden came back properly, not just surviving, but producing the way it had before Ethan had stopped paying it the attention it deserved. Clara had opinions about the drainage and the spacing, and she was right about both, and he told her so. And she accepted it without particular triumph, which was one of the things he'd noticed about her. She was not a woman who needed to be right. She just happened to be right fairly often, and she didn't dress it up. Margaret Doyle wrote back. The letter came through Ridgecrest, and Cole Pryor sent it up with the Hale boy, and Clara read it at the kitchen table, and Ethan watched her face as she read it. Margaret had written 2 pages. He could see from the density of the handwriting that it was 2 full pages, nothing wasted. Clara finished reading and folded it. "Well," he said. "She's ashamed," Clara said. "And she's angry at herself. And she said—" She paused, smoothed the letter with her hand. "She said she's been the first person in this town to spread a story about someone 3 times in her life, and all 3 times she was wrong, and she thought she was doing a service, and she's going to try to remember that." Ethan said nothing. "That's more than most people manage," Clara said quietly. "It is," he agreed. She put the letter away. She also said there are 7 families between here and Millhaven who've been contacted by the federal inquiry, she said. People who lost land. They're being asked to testify. Something moved in Ethan's chest. 7, he said. At least 7. She said there may be more. Clara looked at him. They're coming forward. People who spent years thinking they couldn't do anything. They're coming forward now because someone finally opened the door. He thought about Samuel Pratt, writing in the last months of his life, afraid and ashamed and determined. He thought about Ruth pressing the box into Clara's hands at the graveside. He thought about 8 weeks on the run, and a mountain trail, and 4 armed men, and a wire from Ridgecrest that got to Helena before Cross did. He thought about his brother. Jamie would have been one of them, he said. It came out quiet, not broken, and just honest. If he'd lived, he would have been one of the 7. Clara looked at him across the kitchen. He is one of them, she said. Just the other way. He's the reason you understood what we were doing. She held his gaze. He's part of why it worked. Ethan was still for a moment. Then he nodded. Yeah, he said. Reckon he is. The summer moved through July and into August, and the mountain did what it did in summer, pressed its heat down through the days, and let the evenings cool, and the mornings were sharp and clean, and smelled like pine and moving water. Clara had planted a second row of vegetables along the east side of the garden that she said would produce into September if the frosts held off, and Ethan had stopped going to check the fence as an excuse to be out of the house because he'd run out of reasons to need excuses. They worked alongside each other and ate at the same table and argued about the drainage and the fence posts, and once memorably about the best way to treat a horse with a swollen joint. And Clara was right about that too, which he admitted after 3 days when the swelling went down. She didn't say I told you so. She just handed him the coffee she'd already made and went back out to the garden. He watched her go and thought about the woman who had told him in a diner in Helena that she wouldn't be beholden, and how that had never been what this was, and how she'd known it, and he'd known it, and they'd both been careful not to say it out loud before it was ready to be said. The afternoon it came was not a dramatic afternoon. There was no particular event leading to it. He had come in from the barn, and she was at the kitchen counter doing something with herbs from the garden, and the house smelled like green things and coffee, and she turned when she heard him come in and said, "Ruth is coming." He stopped. "Coming here. She wrote last week. I wanted to tell you when I was sure." Clara set down what she was holding and turned fully to face him. "She wants to see the mountain. She wants to see where her father's papers ended up, where they went from." A pause. "She said she's never been out of Millhaven. She said she wants to see what's past it." He thought about Ruth Pratt, this woman he'd never met, who had pressed a wooden box into Clara's hands at a graveside and changed the course of everything. "When?" he said. 2 weeks. Clara looked at him carefully. "Is that all right? I know it's our place," he said. The words came out before he'd decided to say them. He heard them land, and he didn't take them back because they were true, and he was done doing the thing where he talked around the true things. Clara went very still. She looked at him with those eyes that had catalogued exits on the first day and had never quite stopped being careful, that had watched him from a measured distance for weeks, that had been honest with him in ways that cost her something. Every time that had looked at 4 armed men on a mountain trail and found the thing in them that meant they didn't have to be what Cross had made them. "Our place," she said. "If you want it to be," he said. "And I know you said you won't be beholden. I know you said equal. I'm not asking you because you need a place to be. I'm asking you because this place is better when you're in it. Different from what it was. And I've been alone up here long enough to know the difference." She looked at him for a long moment. "Ethan?" "Yeah. That is the most words I've ever heard you say in one stretch." "I know," he said. "I had them prepared." Something broke open in her face. Not sadness, not fear, not the careful composure she'd been maintaining since the first day he found her. Something that was genuinely and completely her, the woman underneath all of it, and she almost laughed and didn't quite, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not grief. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I should tell you that. I don't. I've been alone a long time too. Before the running. Before Cross. I know how to work, and I know how to fight, and I know how to keep a promise, but I don't know how to—" She stopped. "I don't know how to stay somewhere without waiting for it to end." "Neither do I," he said. 4 years I've been up here waiting for it to end. And it didn't end," he said. "It just got quieter. Until you." He looked at her steadily. "I don't want quiet like that again." She was still. "I'm going to be called to Helena," she said. "Possibly multiple times. The trial, when it happens, could go on for months. I know. I have my own way of doing things. I noticed. I'll argue with you about the drainage. You're right about the drainage. I know I am." Something moved in her face. "I'm not easy, Ethan. Neither am I," he said. "Ask anyone who's tried to have a conversation with me in the last 4 years." She looked at him. He looked back. "Stay," he said, quietly, directly, without the careful framing or the arrangement language or the equal exchange. "Just stay, not because you need to, because you want to." Clara Whitfield stood in the kitchen of a mountain house that she had fixed and tended and come back to after 3 days in the saddle running for her life. And she looked at Ethan Callahan, who had walked out of his barn into her crisis and had not once flinched, and she thought about the woman she'd been in Mill Haven, competent and capable, and profoundly alone, and the woman she'd been for 8 weeks on the mountain, still capable, more alone, carrying something that was almost too heavy. And she thought about the morning in a diner in Helena when she hadn't checked the exits. She thought about what forward looked like. "All right," she said. He didn't smile right away. He just held her gaze and nodded once. The way he nodded when something had been decided and was now settled, and then the corner of his mouth moved. "I'll fix the south fence too," he said. She almost laughed. Almost. "Don't push it," she said. He did smile then fully, and it changed his whole face, and she realized she hadn't seen it before. Not this, not the real one. And she thought that she would need to see it again, because it was different from what she'd expected, warmer and younger, and more open than the man who'd ridden her across a mountain with a rifle on his back, and 5 of Cross's riders behind them. 2 weeks later, Ruth Pratt arrived. She came on the stage to Ridgecrest, and the Hale boy brought her up in the wagon, and she was smaller than Clara had described, and younger looking than her losses should have allowed, with her father's careful eyes and her own particular quality of stillness that Clara said came from being the daughter of a man who had spent 20 years making himself invisible. She walked into the yard, and she looked at the mountain, and she looked at the house, and she looked at Clara, and then she did what Clara had not done, and probably would not have done, which was to go directly into Clara's arms and hold on. Clara held her back. Ethan stood by the barn and gave them the time they needed and watched 2 women stand in a yard in the summer light, holding the weight of what Samuel Pratt had done and what it had cost and what it had finally managed to do. After a while, Ruth pulled back and looked at Clara and said, "He would have wanted to know you were safe." "I'm safe," Clara said. Ruth looked at the house, at the garden, at Ethan by the barn. "Yes," she said with a small and genuine smile. "I can see that." She stayed 4 days. She and Clara talked for hours about Samuel, about Millhaven, about the inquiry, and what it would mean for the families who'd been taken from, about what Ruth was going to do now that the thing she'd feared for months was no longer something to fear. Ethan mostly stayed out of those conversations because they were not his to be in, but occasionally he was in the kitchen when they happened. And he listened, and he understood things that hadn't been in the papers in the wooden box. The texture of what Cross had done, the years of small accumulated pressure. The way a whole community had been quietly rearranged around one man's appetite. He thought about that. He thought about what a town looked like when it started to get its shape back. On Ruth's last morning, she came out to the porch where Ethan was sitting with his coffee, and she sat down beside him and looked at the mountain and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "She told me about your brother." He was quiet. "She said you understood what it was to watch the law get used the wrong way," Ruth said, "and that it's why you helped her." "Partly," he said. "What's the other part?" He looked at the mountain. "Reckon you can figure that out," he said. Ruth looked at him sidelong, and she had her father's eyes, but she smiled like her own self. "Yes," she said. "I think I can." She left that afternoon, and the house settled back into its two-person quiet. And that evening Clara came and sat on the porch step beside Ethan close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and they watched the summer light do what it did at the end of a good day, which was to take its time going. "She said she's going to stay in Mill Haven," Clara said. "After the trial. She said she wants to be there when it's over, to see it." "Good," Ethan said. "She said her father's name is going to be in the record," Clara said. "As a witness for the federal case, in the official record." She paused. "Not as Nathaniel Cross's land manager, as Samuel Pratt witness for the prosecution." He thought about an old man writing in the last months of his life, afraid and ashamed. "That's right," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." The light moved, and the mountain held still, and the summer evening pressed its warmth into the porch boards, and neither of them moved. Clara said, "I never thought I'd want to stay somewhere again, after Mill Haven. I thought the best I could do was keep moving and keep the box safe and get it to the right place and then figure out what came after." "And now," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Now I know what comes after," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the mountain, at the enormous patient face of it, going gold in the last light, and something in her expression was so completely unguarded that he felt the particular privilege of being trusted with the sight of it. "You know what I kept thinking about," she said, "when we were riding on the third day when the horses were tired, and we didn't know if the wire had gotten through, and Cross's men were behind us, and I didn't know how it was going to go." "What?" he said. "The kitchen garden," she said. "I kept thinking about the east row, whether I'd planted the second row deep enough, whether it would still be there." She paused. "I'd never thought about something like that in the middle of something like that before. I'd never had anything planted anywhere that was mine to come back to." He looked at her. "Did it hold?" he said. She almost smiled. "It held," she said. They sat together as the light finished going, and the first stars appeared, and the mountain went from gold to gray to its own darkness, and the house behind them was warm, and the garden was growing, and somewhere in a federal evidence room in Helena, a wooden box sat with its brass latch latched, and everything Samuel Pratt had written inside it, waiting for the courts and the time they took, and the slow, certain weight of truth that had been too long in arriving. Clara leaned her shoulder against Ethan's, just slightly, just the weight of it, and he didn't move away, and neither did she, and the mountain held them both, the way mountains held everything, without preference, without ceremony, without any particular concern for what they'd been before they got there. It only cared that they were there, and they were. This place had never felt like home before. But that was the thing about mountains. They didn't ask you what you'd been, or where you'd come from, or what name a man with lawyers had put on you when he wanted you gone. They just stood there patient and enormous, and they waited for you to stop running, and when you finally did, they were exactly what they'd always been. Still, solid, unchanged, and somehow without either of them having planned it or predicted it, or even quite believed it was possible for people who had both been alone for so long. The mountain had become home for two people who had needed one more than they'd known how to say. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.